a brief recap of what we went last time. So it was like a month ago, roughly. We're talking about the Middle Ages, so the 3 different ages that were considered the Middle Ages. And then we talked about the rise of the Pope, how the Pope got his authority, how the Pope raised in power and started to get this spiritual and political authority. And so that was kind of like what we talked about last time. And to continue, we're going to be talking about Islam. And now you might be a little confused why we're talking about Islam. But this is because Islam did have influence on Christianity, and Christianity had influence on Islam. So we're going to focus on that part. We're not going to go through the whole history, just a brief introduction to Islam. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the relationship between Islam and Christianity. So the way it first started, Muhammad was a merchant, and he went up to the city of Damascus. And as he was up there, there was an Aryan monk. Now, again, Arianism is when they believe that God created Jesus. So Jesus was created by God. That's what Arians believe. And so there was a monk like that. And he prophesied to Muhammad that Muhammad will become the next prophet. He will become a great prophet of God. And so some consider Islam as a heresy, a Christian heresy, just like Arianism and other heresies that arose. So some would consider Islam as a Christian heresy. And so, he was an Aryan monk that prophesied that Muhammad would become a great prophet. And so Muhammad went back to Medina. That's where he was from. And he was in the midst of a city conflict. So there's a community of Jews, Christian, and Arabs. And Muhammad was as a mediator between all of them. And that's why he rose in power, he rose in authority in that city. And eventually, he started borrowing things from the Jews, from the Christians to like make, for the religion of Islam, he borrowed things from the Jews, from the Christians, put it in the Quran. If you, whoever has read the Quran, you will see there's very similar things in the Old Testament, very similar things in the Jewish writings, also Christian things intermixed. And so pretty much he mixed those things together, put it in the Quran, and claimed that it was derived from Gabriel, the archangel. And so after that, we see that all this, he also, a strong claim in the Quran talks about that Jesus was just a man. That's a very strong claim that Jesus is not God, he is a man. And this could be from Aryan influence. That's possible because it was an Aryan monk that told him that he's going to prophesy. He had Aryan influence, so it's possible. But even if it's not, we are not surprised because he's an ungenerated man, not born again, and a person that's not with God always opposes God. So it's not surprising that he talks negatively about Jesus in the case of his deity. So Islam starts around 622 AD, and Muhammad first took over Medina, became the ruler of it. Then he went to Mecca. Mecca was a grand city. It was a merchant city, and it had a lot of commercial people coming there for merchandise, and it was very popular, very progressive, and it was polytheistic. And Muhammad was monotheistic. So he focused on Allah alone and no other gods. And so he started to, he took it over and made it a monotheistic city. And so by the year 632, Islam was widespread. So the way they did it, they took over lands, conquered them, forced them to become Christians, or not Christians, to become Muslim. And so as they were conquering tribes, they were killing those that did not convert to Islam unless they had some money that they could pay them. So if you want to continue to be Christian or some other religion, you have to pay them tribute. So most people wanted to, or a lot of people converted because they didn't have the means to pay them or they'll be dead. So they took over, and they eventually took over from the Neo-Persian Empire, so in the east, and then the Middle East, and then eventually they went all the way to Spain, took over the top of North Africa. They eventually went all the way up to Constantinople, took that over. So it was a huge empire, eventually became a huge empire. And so when we look at the relationships between Christianity and Islam, so when the Crusades started happening, that's when the the Crusaders came down and they got this philosophical ideas of Aristotle from the Muslims. So the way it was, Aristotle was lost in the West. So the West was focused on Plato. That was the main philosophical outlook on life, was Plato's philosophy. But the East, where Islamic people were, the scholars, they translated the Aristotle into Arabic, and then they translated it from Arabic to Latin. So that's how the Christians in the West got reintroduced to Aristotle. The West got reintroduced to Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, we'll get to him later, and Western scholars, they used this in the medieval times and pretty much changed the way they looked in philosophical terms. And so the medieval philosophy before this, before the Crusaders, was Platonic. So they talked about Plato, and Plato focused on the mystical things. So, for example, he focused on forms. And what forms was pretty much, they believed there was a perfect thing, transcendent, beyond our mind, beyond our understanding. There's like a perfect thing in heaven. And then that is how we can define what is a chair, what is a pew, what is a pulpit, a mic. So the way they viewed, for example, this pulpit, they would say there's a perfect pulpit, somewhere transcendent that we cannot understand, that we cannot see, but there's a perfect pulpit, and that's how we know that this is a pulpit. And we compare everything to that mystical, transcendent thing. Now, Aristotle focused on the material world, and he said, no, the forms are inside the materials themselves. So they say, we know this is the pulpit because it is the form of a pulpit, and the forms are tied to the physical objects, not something transcendent. So that's a very simple explanation. It's a lot more advanced than that, but we're going to just stop it there. And so Plato has a mystical approach to reality, to life, and Aristotle had an empirical approach, a material approach to reality. And the medieval world was changed from a Platonic way of thinking to an Aristotelian way of thinking. And to this day, our society is an Aristotelian way of thinking. And so we barely touched the surface regarding Islam and the philosophy of Aristotle and Plato. Whoever's interested, you're free to text me, message me on Viber or through text message, and I can explain more if you would like. But we're going to continue on from there and go to the Franks. Now, this is a barbaric tribe that started it's a Germanic tribe. They started around the times the Romans were in power, and they were partners with Rome. Some of the Franks, they mixed with the Romans, and some of them didn't mix with the Romans, so held their own culture. But they were in the German area, and then they eventually went down into the places where Rome used to rule. And they grew in power when Rome fell, so they grew in power, and they pretty much took over most of Europe from Germany to France. And for that whole area was pretty much ruled by the Franks. And eventually, later on, they split into two, and now those countries are known as Germany and France. So that's what happened when the kingdom divided, and it is the French that kept the Frankish tradition, and that's why it sounds very similar to France. So they kind of became known as the Franks or the France. And so it started with the Franks, and it started with, there's a guy named Clovis the First. And he was the first to unite the Franks under one tribe. So before there were barbaric tribes, and they had a bunch of different kings. And Clovis the First is the one that united all those barbarian tribes into one tribe and made it into kind of like an empire, like a mini empire. And he became their king. And they were known as the Merovingian dynasty. And the Merovingian dynasty, they grew out their beards, grew out their hair, and they considered this long hair as representative of power. So whoever had long hair, whoever had a big beard, they were powerful. And the Franks were pagan. Unlike some of the other barbaric tribes which were around them, many of those tribes were Arian. And the reason is why, because if you remember the councils, they rejected Arianism, and they exiled all the Arian bishops, all the Arian pastors and priests outside of Rome. So they went to the barbarians and taught the barbarians and taught the heresy to the barbarians. And so the barbarians outside of Rome became Arian. because those were the missionaries, or the people that got exiled became missionaries to them. So those other tribes were barbaric tribes, but the Franks were pagan. And so Clovis's wife, she was a Catholic. So she believed the Trinity. The Arians believed that Jesus was created. Clovis's wife, she was a Catholic. She believed in the Trinity. And out in a battle one time, as he was fighting, he saw that he was losing. So he cried out to the God of his wife and said, if you show me favor, I will serve you. So he was helped in the battle. The battle turns to his favor. He won that battle. And eventually, when it was in 508, around Christmas time, he was baptized into the Catholic faith. And so he was a Catholic, not an Arian. And so the favor of the church in Rome was to Clovis. And so they favored them over the Arian tribes because the Arians are heretics, and Clovis was Catholic. So he was sound in faith. And so he raised that empire, and then his sons, they were not as noble as Clovis. They were corrupt, worse spiritually and politically as well. And the grandsons were even worse. So an example of one of the grandsons of Clovis denied the Trinity, and he practiced polygamy, and he also killed one of his wives. So we see how downhill it went from there. And then next time we're going to be continuing talking about the Frank Empire, how it rose back up, and how it affected the church.